to get a raise, and all you're doing is saying to these people, well, these old people already got the raise, now you can have one. Which I don't think is right. I don't think they should get the equivalent of what the police, fire, and public work department get on increases in wages. Not they're going to be making the same amount of money, but if you figure it out, they'll be making the same amount of money. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. On the motion, which is for $93,000 to fund the salary pool supplement budget, all those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. General Services. Page 28, Mr. Daly. Mr. Daly, you have the floor.
Thank you. I move to appropriate the sum of $104,077 to fund the town clerk budget as specified on lines 43 and 44 as printed in the FinCom Recommends column of the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Is there any, does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Vaca? Just a minute.
Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen have a recommendation? Mr. Washburn?
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $78,492 to fund the Elder Services budget as specified on lines 45 and 46 as printed in the FinCom Recommends column of the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Vaca?
Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen wish to make a recommendation? Mr. Washburn?
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $51,956 to fund the Veteran Services budget as specified on lines 47 and 48 as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column of the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Vaca?
The Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen have a recommendation? Mr. Washburn?
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $177,853 to fund library salaries, line 49, and $64,555 for library expenses, line 50.
You've heard the motion. Line 50 is different from printed on the warrant. 64,555. Finance Committee recommendation, Mrs. Waka.
Finance recommends.
Board of Selectmen's recommendation, Mr. Washburn.
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Mr. Daly, do you wish to be heard on your motion? Mr. Daly.
Brief explanation there is in order. The slight increase in the expense line for the library is to bring us up to the threshold amount that we have to appropriate in order to maintain our state funding, which is supplemental to the library budget in the amount of $10,000 a year. If we appropriate below that amount, of 64,555, we lose that $10,000 additional.
Mr. Reitmeier.
There's unless my figures are wrong, there's an increase of about 21,000 over the previous expenses, previous budget.
Mr. Daly.
That is correct.
Is this adding personnel, or is this just raises spread over the present personnel?
This does not add personnel. It accounts for some pay increases that were given to the management staff in the library during fiscal '94, and it also accounts for an increase in the materials being purchased from last year to next, from this year to next year.
Under salaries, though, it shows 156.16 as opposed to 177.853. That's approximately 21,000 on salaries.
Bear with me for just a minute.
Mr. Daly.
Mr. Reitmeier, those who have been through the budget process with the selectmen and myself this year will remember that I've had somewhat of a mental block on this particular number. It's very easily explained, however. The salary adjustments made to the management positions in the library totaled just over $11,000 in fiscal '94. You may recall that those were among the salary adjustments that there was an appropriation made for in October of '93. The additional $11,000 there is accounted for in step increases according to the clerical workers contract for the present library staff. All of the library staff, except for one person, is due a step increase in the coming year.
How many people are we talking on this?
7. 7.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. On the motion, which is for $177,853 to fund library salaries and $64,555 for library expense, line 50, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $45,074 to fund the recreation budget as specified on lines 51 and 52 as printed in the Finance Committee recommends column of the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation, Mrs. Vaca?
Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen have a recommendation, Mr. Washburn?
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Now we still got one section of the omnibus to go with. Surprise, surprise, Public Works. Which is on page 26 of the printed copy of the warrant.
To the expenses. And now I gotta change 40 up here.
Okay,
886.
that's for operations, right? So I have to put...
Mr. Daly, you have the floor for the purpose of making a motion under Article 10, line items 34 through 42.
Point of order, Mr. Moderator.
Point of order. State your point of order, Mr. Goodwin.
How about 54, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, and 58? On page 29.
Yes, they were considered at the last meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $886,303 to fund the Public Works Operations budget, lines 34 and 35, as follows. Line 34, will read $474,517, and line 35 will read $411,786.
You've heard the motion, which is otherwise than in the printed version of the warrant. The total is $886,303, of which line item 34 gets $474,517 as printed in the warrant, and line item 35 gets $411,786. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation, Mrs. Vaca?
Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen have a recommendation, Mr. Washburn?
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Does Mr. Daly wish to explain his motion? Mr. Daly.
Yes, Mr. Moderator. In light of the past two winters, the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen have acknowledged that the $45,000 that we appropriate for snow and ice expenses, which is about halfway down the page 26, is inadequate. Last year we spent about $230,000 on this item, and this year we spent over $260,000 for the snow and ice removal. So the Finance Committee and Selectmen are proposing to increase this appropriation to $85,000, which, if we ever get back to typical winters, as we've had over the past couple of decades, should be very nearly the appropriate amount.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $654,708 to fund the solid waste management budget as specified on lines 36 and 37 as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column of the warrant, along with the accompanying transfers.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation, Mrs. Vaca?
Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen have a recommendation, Mr. Washburn?
The Board of Selectmen recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $72,055 to fund the cemetery budget as specified on lines 38 and 39 as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column of the warrant, along with the accompanying transfers.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Vaca?
Yes, the Finance recommends.
Does the Board of Selectmen have a recommendation, Mr. Washburn?